well, how the momentum can swing. I think if you'd have said last week, who did I think was going to win the championship and who did I think was going to perform best at the Brazilian Grand Prix, I'd have definitely said Red Bull, Verstappen and Red Bull Verstappen, because that's just the way it seemed to be going. But lo and behold, Mercedes certainly pulled it out of the bag here. Turns out straight line speed is much more effective and important at the Sao Paulo Autodromo Jose Carlos Pache circuit. Haha, I didn't remember it this time. Much more important than we thought it was, or at least I thought it was at the beginning of the weekend. So a fairly dominant weekend for Mercedes. It's been a while since we've seen such a Mercedes dominant race, a Mercedes dominant weekend. They have basically been the ones to beat from the start of practice on Friday. Obviously this was a sprint race and fun for you guys. We're actually talking about a sprint race weekend, not buried in the middle of the whole rest of the season that I never got around to doing. So we can actually talk about it a little bit more and reflect on that and their plans for that moving into 2022, which I'm not happy with, but we will discuss that all in due course. Let's first focus on the race. Let's talk about the sprint first, and then let's talk about the race itself. So the sprint race, qualifying pretty much when its qualifying was predicted to go. Mercedes got a 1-3. Verstappen managed to split the pair. Hamilton on pole. But I'm sure if you're watching this, you probably already know the entire DRS wing debacle that is somehow still going on now, even though it's been concluded, as I alluded to before we started. This is literally 3 hours after the race. This is being recorded on the Sunday the 14th night. So all of this stuff is still very recent, which hopefully reflects when this goes live. Hopefully it'll make sense, and hopefully that's how we can do them moving forwards. Basically, just in case you don't know, there is a very standard test that is done on the cars when they go into parc fermé, which is by using an 85mm, which I don't think that measurement is right. It's the measurement people keep saying, but 85mm is minuscule. But yeah, basically it's a little device that's a certain thickness that they push through the rear wing, either when it's open or closed, don't quite know which, but it's basically to test that when it goes into DRS, it's not giving too much, because if it goes further, you get more of the DRS effect. I think it's more downforce, so the car is pressed lower into the track, which means it can go faster. Obviously, if you've got the DRS advantage and then some, that's not fair to the other competitors. So there is a regulatory distance that thing can open. Basically what happened was Hamilton's car didn't pass that test, and then they did it again, I didn't pass that test, and then they did it again, and they did it 4 times, and it continued to fail the test. Now, normally you would go, well, Alice, that's black and white. How on earth did that manage to take over 12 hours to work out and come to a conclusion on, to decide whether or not the rear wing was illegal when it failed the test 4 times? Well, I will tell you, dear viewer, that is because at the end of the sprint qualifying session on Friday afternoon, evening, whatever time you watched it, wherever you are on the world, Max Verstappen decided he was going to go and do what most drivers do and take a little check out of that rear wing. He was looking for something completely different. An ongoing thing apparently with Mercedes and Red Bull that we're probably going to hear a lot more about in the next week on the build up to Qatar, so super excited for that. And he touched the rear wing, and so Mercedes were claiming that prior to the start of the qualifying session, the rear wing was passing the test, and then post the session it wasn't. So they were deeming that either Verstappen or something had damaged the wing and it was broken, and that's why it was now failing the test. Point of the matter being, it failed parc fermé, which is, as happened, a straight disqualification from the session. The cars have regulations and mandatory things on them that keep racing fair, that keep the competition, which is already splitting up as it is, as close basically as they can, so that no team can kind of exploit an advantage. So that meant that for the sprint race on Saturday, Hamilton was starting at the very back of the grid. He was already sitting on a 5-place grid drop for Sunday because he'd taken a new internal combustion engine. Verstappen was then on pole for the sprint, Bottas second, Perez third. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sainz third. Anyway, Perez third. Sorry. Anyway, at the start of that, Bottas bossed it. Hamilton, that was a good line. Hamilton did a very good job because he was at the back. All the cars have to wait until the final car is on the grid before the lights even start going out. He did a very good job of making the guys up the front sit at the front for a very long time, which obviously, whilst the car is stationary, the tyres cool, which is why they do the formation lap, to get the heat into the tyres, because once they come out, they're in the hot tyre blankets, and then once they come out the hot tyre blankets, they're getting cooler. The longer they're stationary, the cooler they get. So obviously they sit on the grid for like 20-25 minutes before they even move to get going for the race, and that's why we had the formation lap, because it would be dangerous to send them out on cold tyres, because cold tyres have less grip. Okay, so they need to be hot. Think of it like, I mean, you might already know this, but just in case you don't, think of it like think of it like a hard sweet, like a hard-boiled candy, or I call them sucky sweets, but they're hard sweets, right? That is not sticky to touch when you just hold it. But if you hold it for long enough, it starts to get warm in your hand, and then it starts to go sticky, and it grips to your hand better, right? That is a Formula One tyre. That's a great analogy. Good job, brain. So Hamilton did a very good job of making the grid sit still for a long time, especially the guys right up the front, which cooled Bottas and Verstappen and Perez's tyres all down. Verstappen and Sainz and some of the other drivers on the grid took a gamble on putting on the soft compounded tyre. Now, in a 21 race lap, it's doable on a soft compounded tyre, so long as the performance in that tyre doesn't drop so much. And because it's the soft compounded tyre, or the softest compounded tyre they have the option for, it has the least durability. Pirelli was saying to everybody, don't go out on the softs, they're not going to make it through 21 laps. Things that worked for the soft runners were, it was cold, the ambient temperature was cold, which meant the tyres didn't heat so much, which meant they didn't burn through so much, right? So that helped. And people were good at protecting them, I guess. I felt like I had a second point there, but I guess I don't. The soft runners did do very well yesterday in the sprint race, not yesterday, because I don't know when you're watching it. Yeah, so the soft runners did really well. Bottas got a complete jump on both Red Bulls, as did Carlos Sainz. Bottas moving up into the lead of that sprint race, which he never gave up throughout the 21 laps, and Sainz managing to get up to third. Perez and Verstappen really struggled in the dirty turbulent air, so that's when you're following a car, when you're behind another car. Even if you're about a second behind a car, which is obviously DRS activation, think of it, they're braking the air, and to a point you're in a nice slipstream where you're gaining on them because you've got not as much air resistance as you're driving, right? This is getting very technical. You probably already know this. But if you get too close, you're too close to get the slipstream effect, and then you're just in turbulent air, which has been disrupted, but it's not resettled again as it's come off the other car. So you're in disruptive air, which means not only is the air hitting your car still, it's hitting your car in ways your car is not designed to have it hit, right? Clean air is going over the way the aerodynamics of the car is working perfectly. That's one of the regulations of 2022, is to hopefully make these cars follow more closely, which means hopefully we get more on-track fights. Bottas completely disappeared and absolutely dominated the sprint race. Hamilton charged through the field and made it back up to P5, which was a net P10 start for Sunday's race. Sainz did an excellent job not burning out the tyres, but also keeping ahead of Perez to hold into a third place start for Sunday. So then the top 10 was basically set as Bottas, Verstappen, Sainz, Perez, Hamilton, who then dropped down to P10 and promoted Norris, Leclerc, Gasly, Ocon and Vettel. Ricciardo just missing out on a top 10 start there, starting P11 today. Now today was much hotter, the track was warmer, the ambient temperature, I think track temperature was like 24 yesterday and 50 today. So a lot hotter today. So the track temperature was warmer, which was a bit of a debate as to whether that would help or hinder Mercedes, because they'd been quick, but they hadn't been on track temperatures this hot. So obviously it could overheat the tyres, or tyres could burn out faster than expected. There's a lot of other factors that come into play when track temperature is so high. Also didn't know how Red Bull were going to handle that. They struggled with the colder track, but with the track warming up again, would they be in a better position? And then also it also pulled into the fact that all of the people who'd started well and done the race on Saturday well on the soft tyres now had another element that meant they probably wouldn't be able to repeat that performance, because the track temperature was so hot that the tyres would burn out quicker and fall off the cliff quicker and lose performance faster. It took Hamilton 5 laps to get up into P3. He was helped by Bottas, who did swap with him. Makes perfect sense. If anyone predicted anything different, that was silly, because it makes perfect sense why they would have had swapped them for the Drivers' Championship. They get the same points as a constructor, but for the Drivers' Championship, Hamilton gets more. So that's an important factor, and to be honest, even when they were talking to Bottas before the race and they were like, "You're starting from pole, do you think you're going to win?" I was like, nope, because if Hamilton is anywhere in a shout of being on that podium, and he will, looking at the performance from yesterday, they were always going to swap them around as well. So a very dominant race from Mercedes. They tried to get Red Bull on the undercuts. They got Perez but missed Verstappen. Verstappen led up until the 59th lap of the race, which was impressive considering that Mercedes was the fastest car on track today. There was a bit of a sticky situation about whether he went a bit wide going into turn 1 and forced Hamilton wide to protect the first place position, which then cost Hamilton some time and he dropped back for a few laps. But to be fair, the overtake was inevitable. And I kind of agree with the decision to just leave it and let it be a racing incident and carry on, because there is the possibility that we are managing too much at the moment. And there's a hell of a lot of sofa referees, or what do they call them, armchair referees or something, I think they're referred to as. Just people. The thing is with social media and stuff, and even me doing this, like everyone just feels they have the right to voice their opinion, right? They have their right to say what they think about what happened and incidents and all this, that and the other. And sometimes it should just be let go, and they get a bit close. That's what we want. We want them racing wheel to wheel. We don't want all this stuff now that drivers are getting to park firm and getting too scared to go near anyone else's car just in case they get fined. I mean, it's a fine. Most of them are on much more than that. That's like, I don't know, a week's salary to them, if that. So, or like their race bonus, if that. So they're not going to be super worried about these fines. But there were talks after the race about now having to be much more stricter about how they police park firmly. It's just like, just leave it alone. So long as no one's breaking someone else's car, right? That's a different story. If I go up and pull the barge board off and go, whoopsie, I've broken your car. Okay, that's very different than me coming up and running my hand across the top of it, or if you've got some little winglets, just feeling them or getting a bit close and having a little look. Sebastian Vettel's the best for it. He's literally had his head inside the Mercedes cockpit before. It's just annoying that now it's a problem, after all of these years of it not being a problem. But back to the race. An absolutely dominant race from Hamilton, Mercedes. I think they think that they could have had the 1-2 today, and had they played things differently, I think they really could have. I think Bottas was quicker, but not close. Somehow he ended up like 10 seconds behind the fighting front pair, which was incredible. I don't know how that happened, because in all intents and purposes, even if he'd have come out the pits 10 seconds behind them, he should have been closing in at a rate of knots to that front leading fight, because the Mercedes was the fastest car this weekend. But when Toto Wolff jumped on the radio and said, "Oh, go get him, Valtteri," he looked at the timings like he's 10 seconds behind with what, 10, 12, 15 laps to go at that point. It's not going to happen. Had he got close, it would have, because the Brazilian circuit does lend to overtaking, which is one of the reasons it's a good race, funnily enough. A good job from Verstappen, really, to hold on to P2. And I guess Red Bull have come out and said it was damage limitation, this race, which I suppose is how Mercedes saw the Mexican Grand Prix. It's interesting, because to me, I'd have thought that the Mexican circuit would have suited the Mercedes more, because it's got some really long straights on that circuit. And whereas because the Brazilian circuit doesn't have your typical long straights, it's more cornering speed and this kind of stuff, because it's kind of it's like a wobbly circle, if you will. It's not really got any, I mean, it's got straights, but you know what I mean? I don't have the mini map, I can't look at it. But it doesn't have like a long straight like Mexico has. So I would have thought that this would have lended more to Red Bull. But we have found that this season, that circuits you'd think would lend to Red Bull lend to Mercedes and vice versa. So we've been getting some unpredicted results, which has been quite fun. I gotta say, this is probably one of the best races of the season. It was engaging all the way through, it was entertaining all the way through. Yes, we've only got the fight between the main two anyway, but that's just been the season. It's at least not been two Mercedes fighting each other, right? We've actually had some decent battles on track. So I would put this down as of this moment as one of the best races of the season. Very exciting race. On the edge you see the whole thing, very tense race all the way through the whole 71 laps. I don't think there was any moment where I was like, ugh, bored, spin on. I was engaged for the whole thing, right? Which is hard and fast to come by for me in races. Like the Mexican Grand Prix last weekend was okay, but the beginning was okay and the end was okay, but the middle was super lulled. And I did talk about that on that video, so go check that out if you want to hear more thoughts on that one. To quickly run down the rest of the top 10, Perez came back 4th, unable to do anything to hold up Hamilton or to fight back from Bottas once he had got back ahead of them after Bottas's bad start. I think I didn't even mention that, but Bottas had a bad start. It was a Mercedes 1-2 for the first, well, still the first round of pit stops really. Mercedes managed to undercut Bottas, Perez with Bottas in that first round of pit stops as well. So Perez did all he could. He basically got the maximum he could have got behind not passing the Mercedes. So like I said, I think the Mercedes was just the fastest car this weekend, and for Red Bull to get a 2-4 out of that is impressive. They've at least still got, they've lost more traction in the constructors, but they've at least still got that decent lead on Hamilton in the drivers, right? 5th and 6th was the Ferrari duo. Sainz had a bit of a tough race today after his great performance in the sprint yesterday. Just couldn't really seem to keep up with the pace of his teammate or obviously those cars out in front. But once again, really solidifying Ferrari as our 3rd fastest car right now. They've really done a good job with that car in bringing it up the field. Obviously at the moment, Mercedes and Red Bull are just too far into the distance really for anyone to be thinking about closing the gap, if I'm being honest, and that unfortunately I think is something that's going to translate into the new year and up to 2025, because we have the engine freeze come in now. So I think they're kind of established as a 3rd place team unless they find a loophole and do something pretty funky with their aero next year, hopefully, because I think it would be good. The more cars you have fighting at the front, the better, for sure. It's much more interesting when you going 12 cars could win and I genuinely don't know which one it's going to be. So that would be good. But a great performance from them, even though I think them in themselves are a bit miffed about the performance. It is still a solid 5th and 6th. It is still a solid 3rd fastest car on the grid, because the only cars ahead of them are the Mercedes and the Red Bulls, and importantly for them, it's more points on McLaren in the constructors fight. Gasly having a decent race to come across the line in 7th, ahead of the Alpine pair of Ocon ahead of Alonso, and finally Lando Norris came across with the last points of the race. A pretty bad weekend for McLaren, honestly. They had a bit of an awful one off the start. Sainz had a bad start off the line. Norris tried to go around the outside. Basically, the door got closed. That was a simple racing incident, unfortunately. The two came together and Norris very unfortunately got a puncture, which put him in the pits early doors, which means it was a recovery race for him. All things being said, it being a recovery race, a very decent job to even get back up into the points. Again though, did have a Mercedes engine on board, so did have that speed advantage over the others. Probably helped and aided him getting up the grid as quickly as he did. But at least to hold on to those positions and at least bring home a point for McLaren in what was all in all a bit of a rubbish weekend for them. Unfortunately, Daniel Ricciardo retired with a power unit issue, which probably will raise a few eyebrows for Mercedes. Mercedes engines, we found out, when they put them in afresh, are pretty quick off the line, but the degradation over races is like supreme versus the Honda, which does every engine degradates after a race because it's been raced hard for 50 plus laps, right? So every engine sees this degradation after a race, which is why they don't run one engine for all 23 races. That's why we have the pool of engines usually why people go over it, because 3 is not enough, but 3 is for the cost cap, but we go over the cost cap anyway because everyone usually ends up running about 5, which I think is the average for everyone on the grid this year. 4 or 5 people are running. But the degradation speed of the Honda is less, so like a softer slope, a not so steep, I can't think of the word, a not so steep slope versus the Mercedes, which performance drops quite a lot. So it's probably wouldn't be surprising that Hamilton will be a force to be reckoned with here, probably in Qatar as well, and it may be that Mercedes trade out for a less used engine ahead of the final 2 races of the season, because the performance of this engine will probably be on its weakest going into the last 2 races. And obviously, as we all see where the championship is going now, because it's literally pendulum swung so much in the last few races. Like last week I'd have been like, Red Bull have got both of them in the bag, and now I'm like, do you know what, genuinely could go either way. So the momentum pendulum and the performance pendulum, and just the lead pendulum, if you will, has been swinging left, right and centre all the way through the season. So I'm confident it's going to the last race of the season, so they'll want Hamilton to be on the quickest engine as possible. So seeing Ricciardo go out with a power unit issue, that's a little bit alarming for them, but I'm sure they know what they're doing and they'll have all of the data they need to make the decisions they need to make to put Hamilton in the best position to keep this fight going for as long as possible. The other retiree we have was Stroll, who had an incident with Tsunoda off the start, or very early in the race, can't quite remember when now. A little bit of a rookie decision, a little bit of an inexperienced decision from Tsunoda, if you will, careering into the side of Stroll's side pod barge board thing. The car was basically falling apart as he was driving. It was not really safe to keep driving it, so he pulled that into the garage probably about midway through the race. And that's kind of, I think I've kind of summed up everything. We went on a few tangents, but I think that's kind of everything that happened at the Brazilian Grand Prix. We've got the Qatar Grand Prix next weekend. It is a MotoGP circuit. We've never driven there with F1 cars. I've never even seen the circuit, so I should probably look that up. I'll look that up. I will look up the Qatar circuit. It looks, hang on, I was looking at it earlier actually. Let's look at it now. Few long straights. It's kind of like a more wiggly version of Austria, from a quick glance at it. I have no idea who's going to be good around there. Like I said, the predictions so far this season have been the reverse of what we've thought. Races we've thought Red Bull would be good at, Mercedes has been good at, and races we thought Mercedes would be good at, Red Bull's been good at. So I think as well there's been part of this engine life thing that I didn't know was going on at all. That's part of it. Red Bull are pretty confident that Mercedes have got something illegal on their rear wing, so that will definitely keep going for a few more weeks. Until the FIA shut that down, which I kind of hope nothing happens, because I'd hate for a championship to be decided on a technical factor, right? I want it to be decided on the track when they're racing, when they're up against each other like they were today, and the fastest guy wins. That's who should win the championship, right? Not who's managed to find a thing on the other one's car that may or may not be legal, and it's just the politics of it. It's just tiring. But the one thing we will talk about before I go is the predicted plan for the sprint race format moving into 2022. I don't know if I agree that the sprint races mix things up, because the thing that mixed up the sprint race this weekend was Hamilton got disqualified and was starting at the back of the grid. And I don't think reverse grids are the way to go either. I think that's silly. But they are thinking about keeping the sprint race. From what I've heard, they're basically going to make a sprint race championship, which is really stupid. I don't get it. I understand not wanting the sprint to impact the championship, and in which case stop giving out points for it. I've been saying that all along. If they're different, unique races, then don't point score the sprints. Just have the whole purpose of the sprint to be to qualify for the race tomorrow, because you could have a really good qualifying and a really naff sprint, or vice versa. You could start 19th, have a blistering start, it could absolutely rain, absolutely chuck it down with rain. You could shoot up the grid, start that one, qualify on speed 19th, but start the race 3rd, right? Signs on Merit should not have started today 3rd, but because of the sprint race and because he played it well yesterday, he did. That's the point of the sprint race. That's the kind of minimal mix-up you get with the sprint race. But to be fair, if it was ever a thing that was done to mix up the grid, it was never gonna work. But basically they're talking about 6 sprint race events next year. Okay, I think they're thinking about still scoring for the top 3, but those points only go towards the sprint championship, and no one will care about anyway, as they don't now. I was watching Ted's notebook after the Brazilian Grand Prix, and he was like, wait, the 2nd place laurel is just thrown across the doesn't anyone want that? It's like, no, we don't care. We don't want a laurel that says we came 2nd in a sprint race to qualify P2. You know what, the proof is in the pudding when we started P2. We don't need a laurel to remember that. None of the drivers, none of the teams, none of the fans care enough about the sprint races to make them their own mini championship. Guess what? Hamilton or Verstappen's gonna win it because they're in the fastest car, and it's quite likely they'll be qualifying 1-2 on the Friday and then finishing in those kind of positions on the Saturday. I'm glad to hear though we're taking the points away from the championship, because I've definitely said this before. I've always said that the points scored on the sprints are silly because you're putting more weight, more importance on certain races than the others, and that's like, that will have an effect on whether you take an engine penalty or not. But I don't agree with a sprint race championship. So apologies if this one's a little bit longer than normal, but we did have 2 races to talk about, and finally did actually give the sprint race a little bit more in-depth looking into. Now they're all done and we can kind of reflect on them and see what they're all about. Do let me know what your thoughts of the Brazilian Grand Prix were down in the coffee pot down below. I would love to carry on this conversation with you. I'm not going to be going into any of the contentious subjects though, because I know there are a few flying around. I've already seen them. I'm not going into them. This is not the place for those conversations. So if you do comment with some contentious stuff, I'll either completely ignore that comment or I may remove it depending on what it says. So I appreciate you wanting to base it. Go to Twitter. You'll find loads of people who want to talk to you about that stuff, or Reddit. Not here. This is not the place for that kind of stuff. Tell me what you think about Qatar. Tell me how you think that race is going to go, and tell me your predictions. Hopefully this one's actually gone up in time prior to the Qatar Grand Prix, so we can actually discuss that before you know the result. Because I know I've not been very good at the timings on the last 2. But hopefully now we're all up to date, and the Brazilian Grand Prix actually wasn't that long ago when this actually went online. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. It's been an absolute blast as always. If you enjoyed this video, go show that like button some good old-fashioned love, and if you want to support the channel, go hit subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss next time I upload a video. Stay awesome, and I will see you all in the next video! Believe after all those drive crate boxes, I still don't own anything Mercedes that I could wear. No hat. I mean, that's kind of all they would give me. Oh yeah, my hair's short now.